नहमदुहु व नसल्ली अला रसूलिल करीम बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम रब्बि इश्रह ली सदरी व यस्सिर ली अमरी वहलुल उक़दतम मिन लिसानी यफ़क़हू क़ौली. Ladies and gentlemen, 17th century's French Revolution actually posed a threat against the Church of England, Church of France, and all the Orthodox as well as the Catholic Church. But that was a very subtle and small threat. It was only at the state level, not exactly the societal level. But with the passage of time, things changed, and liberalism and secularism and even as a byproduct, atheism came into existence. And the famous Hollyoaks and H.G. Wells, they propagated in favor of secularism and liberalism, and they propagated to the level, they said it has to be implemented firmly with force. So that was basically the secular, liberal, fundamentalist agenda. After 9/11, George W. Bush and Tony Blair, they said that there is a life threat for our lifestyle. Our lifestyle is going to be snatched by the Muslim fundamentalists. And during that time, the forces who were basically advocating liberalism, secularism, they entered into every community with an agenda, and with very little voices to counter those. Today, my guest is a very important person, a very potent voice, the man who faced it, and the man who is basically loved by all the Muslims who actually realized the threat of atheism and threat of the culture, the same threat which was basically faced by the Christians some time ago, and now the entire religious world, but particularly the Muslims. The man, a beautiful person, a wonderful personality, Mr. Hamza Andreas. He is with us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I think I spelled very wrong your name.
No, that's fine. You pronounced it as good as you could. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
You are known, and you became known after your famous book, Divine Reality. You have been to Pakistan for so many times, and people of Pakistan, particularly the intelligentsia of Pakistan, knows you very well. What type of threats, intellectual level threats, are presently facing the youth and the people who seek knowledge in shape of atheism, secularism, and liberalism? And what's the agenda? How they move towards the common man?
So this is a very good question. So I've traveled Pakistan, many cities, Karachi, Lahore, Peshawar, Islamabad, Rawalpindi, Faisalabad, and I think other places as well. I've even been to Haripur. Alhamdulillah.
Beautiful place.
And I've engaged with many students, especially the private universities and the elite universities like IBA, Bahriya, LUMS, and others. And I've seen a trend because it's my fourth time here. The first time in Pakistan was around 2012 or 13. Then I visited Pakistan the year after. I think it was the year after. And then I recently visited Pakistan February. And now I'm here in, is it September? September, alhamdulillah. And what I've realized and what I've noticed from and it's limited experience, but what I've noticed is that there are 4 new major religions trying to remove the true religion, which is the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first one is secularism and or liberalism. They're kind of connected, but secularism, as many people know, is basically the separation of the church and state, which has its own philosophical assumptions. And it has its actually
history, three centuries history also.
It does, and it also has its philosophical assumptions because it assumes that only it can deal with competing minorities, if you like, or with minority factions.
Equality, human rights, and all that.
Yeah, well, secularism would argue yes, but that's connected to liberalism as well. So secularism, as it is, right, in an abstract sense, is really stripping religion away from its political character, and it assumes that it only has the system or the framework to deal with competing peoples with competing ideas, whether they're religious or not. And this is kind of it has its own metaphysical and epistemological assumptions. It assumes that the religious and the secular are distinct categories. But from an Islamic paradigm, that's a false assumption, because the God and politics, or Islam and politics, religion and politics, revelation and politics, Quran and politics are kind of the same, because Islam is a worldview. It's the true lenses you put on your eyes to understand yourself, understand reality, and understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it has this kind of metaphysical narcissism. It projects itself onto the world and says, I am the only system or framework or ideology that can actually deal with competing minorities and peoples with religious or non-religious views. And this is false, because it's stripping away falsely the political character of other worldviews, namely Islam. And we know Islam has a rich political history. In actual fact, let's be honest, the curriculum vitae of Islam is a very strong curriculum vitae compared to the secularists, that's for sure.
Yes.
Well, they have about 200 years or so, and it's full of blood. Like if we look at the statistics, there's more blood shed under atheistic, secular, non-religious ideology than
two world wars.
Yeah, than any other time in history.
Yes.
Yeah, and this includes the communists as well. You know, Stalin, I think, killed around 6 million Christians, right? So we have a good CV. So when you look at, you know, by the way, I don't like glorifying our history, because over glorifying Islamic history is a sign of a defeated mind. We've had some bad stuff as well.
Very true.
But there are some good things that happened in Islam. And take Islamic Spain, for example, even the Ottoman period in Islamic history. You see Islamic Spain, it was described as a convivencia by the academics, a coexistence. It was described as paradise on earth. In fact, Professor Thomas Arnold argues that Islamic Spain, Muslim Spain, was that milestone that basically propelled Europe into the Renaissance. Yes. Yeah. And he mentions this in his book, A Preaching of Islam. Now, Islamic Spain had Jews, Christian, and Muslims, different minorities with different ideas, coming together to look into the interconnecting principles of nature. And from that, you had works on poetry, science, mathematics, astronomy, and so on and so forth. And when the Christians forcefully took back Spain, they took all of that work and the amazing literature and the art and the poetry and the science and the mathematics, and it propelled Europe into progress. So they have a debt to the Islamic civilization. And we even have the likes of the second Moses in the Jewish tradition, Musa bin Maymun, also known as Maimonides. He would write in Arabic, and he's a central figure in the Jewish tradition, and he was the physician of Salahuddin Ayyubi. Anyway, so that's secularism. Liberalism, it's kind of connected, because you can't really have, technically speaking or practically speaking, a liberal nation without it being secular. So that's why sometimes you hear things like secular liberalism. But nevertheless, liberalism is really not really a doctrine. It's not a moral doctrine per se. It's more about rights. It's more about an ontology, meaning I'm trying to understand the source and nature of the individual or the human. And they have a particular false assumption, which is individualism or atomism. Liberalism is a disputatious set of doctrines, but fundamentally is based on individualism. And the reason we know this, because, for example, Professor Charles Taylor says that liberalism focuses on the primacy on the individual. The individual takes priority over the community. The individual is first before anything else.
Negates all institutions like family and everything.
Well, I wouldn't say it negates, but it basically dampens it, right?
Dampens.
The feminist philosopher, Professor Marilyn Friedman, not that we take her feminism, of course, feminism is utter bakwas, yeah? We don't take that seriously, but she makes a really good point. She says individualism is the view of the self as an abstract entity devoid from social obligations and attachments.
True.
So you see, they have a particular lens on how to understand the individual in society. It's through the individual, and it's the individual takes priority. That's why the liberal UN Declaration of Human Rights, or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they think it's universal and absolute. It's not. It's a liberal project.
It's a liberal project.
Now, we may agree with some of those rights, but we may not agree with the priority, the application, or the conception. And there may be some that they haven't even mentioned because they see things from an individualist lens, a liberal lens. Even Professor John Shava, in his book, The Liberal Project and Human Rights, he's from the London School of Economics, he makes that point that the UN Declaration of Human Rights is a liberal project. It's not universal and absolute. It's based on an assumption of liberalism. Anyway, so liberalism is based on that view. And liberals want to atomize Pakistani society, for example.
Yes.
Liberals want to basically focus on the self. And that's why you have Western secular ethical theories that are somewhat connected to liberalism, like utilitarianism or ethical egoism and deontological ethics. Because these are secular theories that exist within a secular liberal paradigm. And ethical egoism, for example, is the moral view that one ought to act according to their interests, their individual interests. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory. It looks at, the consequences, just like ethical egoism, but it focuses on the majority. It says the increase in happiness or well-being for the maximum number of people, or the decrease in suffering for the maximum number of people. So these are theories that we inherit from a secular liberal paradigm, and we don't even realize that's the case. But anyway, the point I'm trying to say here is that liberalism aims to atomize society, to individualize them, and also for us to adopt secular liberal ethical normative theories which don't belong to the Islamic tradition. We believe in Allah's commands, divine commands. And that's going to destroy our communitarian, complementarian society. For example, liberalism is failing the West.
Yes.
If you see in the UK and in America, we send our parents to glorified concentration camps, which are old people's homes.
Yes.
We would never do that in Pakistan or the Muslim world, because we have communitarian, timeless values coming from Allah and His Messenger. But they do that because they have an individualistic doctrine. They see the world through the primacy on the individual and connect it to other secular ethics such as utilitarianism. They may argue, or even ethical egoism, how is my old parent now benefiting me? Because ethical egoism says that we ought to act in accordance to our own individual interests. Also, utilitarianism says there must be increased happiness for the greatest number of people. But these old people are not providing any economic well-being or any other type of well-being, they may argue, for society. So put them in old people's homes. So individualism plus some of these ethical theories, they may argue it's completely fine to send your parents into glorified concentration camps.
That's why the population is decreasing, because they think that children are of no use for us.
Absolutely. So it's basically it's self-sabotage, basically.
Yes.
That's what liberalism is. So that's the other. There's more to say about liberalism, but this is a good start.
True.
The other main religion is LGBTQ+. That is an ideology in itself. That's a monster in itself. Yes, it has some liberal assumptions, but it also has things like queer theory, which is based on postmodern applied principles, which is, we don't probably have the time to discuss it, but that's another ism, if you like, that's trying to engulf the hearts and minds of the Muslims, and it has its own false assumptions, which maybe...
It's a complete religion, actually. LGBT is a complete religion now.
It is, because the LGBT narrative is same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity is completely fine, or it's an individual right. And that statement has 5 main assumptions. The first main assumption is that we have not only agency over our own bodies, but we ultimately own our own bodies. There was no creator that created our bodies, and we don't have any duty to the creator. So we have agency and ownership, ultimately, so we could do what we want with our bodies. Now, some religious LGBTQ+ people believe that God may own their bodies, but they say you could do what you want. So that indicates a liberal paradigm, which we could discuss later. But generally speaking, they think they could do what they want with the bodies. Islam disagrees with that because Allah owns us. Allah is the Rabb.
Yes.
He is the master, the owner, the maintainer, the sustainer of everything that exists, including ourselves. Although Allah is giving us agency over our own bodies, we have a duty to Him to act in accordance to His pleasure, because it's His. I belong to Allah. The second main assumption is that they believe that same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity is an individual right. Now, we believe in rights. We have huquq al-nas, huquq al-ibad, the rights of the individual, the rights of humanity, of people. But the problem is, whose conception of rights? A liberal conception of rights? A secular conception of rights? No, we have a divine command conception of rights, because we know it's true. It came from Allah, His Messenger, which we can prove. And who has the right to give us our rights anyway? Allah created us, He has the right. So we won't adopt your individualistic, atomistic notion of rights. So we would completely disagree with that assumption. The other assumption that they have is, they have the assumption that you know, same-sex intercourse and gender fluidity is not immoral. There are no wrong-making features. They assume that because they either adopt ethical egoism, utilitarianism, or deontological ethics, or even maybe virtue ethics, secular, normative, ethical theories. We are under no epistemic or moral obligation to adopt those theories. Tell me why they're objective. Tell me why they're true. They can't, by the way. We can say to you why Allah's commands are true, why believing in them and ensuring and believing that they are the source of all morality. We could show why Allah is true, and we won't follow your ethical theories. We'll follow the Quran and the Sunnah because we know it's come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has the moral picture, we've got the moral pixel, if you want to put it that way. So we believe it has wrong-making features because the wrong-making features they go against the commands of Allah.
Yes, yes.
Simple as that. The other assumption that they have is your identity is formulated by your desires. And this is where liberalism comes in as well, which we should have spoken about earlier, but liberalism essentially reducing the human being to the animal state. Allah wants you to turn from the animal to the angelic realm.
Yes.
It's simple as that, because Allah is saying, you don't identify yourself with your desires. Allah says, have you not seen the one who takes their own Lord, who takes their own desires as their Lord? Allah says, who's more astray than the one who follows the whims and desires? Now, desires are fine if they're expressed within the divine commands, within the Sharia, within what is known to be good for you, because Allah knows what's best for us. However, to identify yourself with your shahawat, your blameworthy desires, is what animals do. In actual fact,
Yes, this is a basic principle of psychology that postponement of desire is the manifestation of normality.
yeah, that's true. That's
basic
true.
principle.
That's true. But what they do, they assume happiness and well-being is always following your desire, which is an animal state. Islam elevates you. Islam says your true identity is that you're an abid, you're a worshipper of Allah, to know Allah, to love Allah, to obey Allah, to direct all acts of worship to Allah alone, to be humble before Him, to submit to Him, to love Him, to adore Him. So this is what your identity is. As Allah says in chapter 30, verse 30, adhere to the fitrah of Allah, to the natural way that Allah has created you. And that is worshipping Allah. And so what they say is, your identity is your desires. And we say, no, we completely categorically reject this. Your identity is connected to your obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Final point. The final assumption is queer theory. Now, queer theory, generally speaking, was motivated by the rejection of biological essentialism. Biological essentialism is that your biology dictates your identity, which we know is not true now. But there is a moderate form of biological essentialism combined with some socialization. It's two things together, which agrees with the Quran and the Sunnah. What they do, they reject any biological essentialism, whether it's moderate or strong. Mm-hmm. They say biology is completely just a construct.
Yes.
Now, why do they do this? Because they follow the applied postmodern principles too. Postmodern principle number one, that there is no method to acquire an objective truth. And that's why they would say, biology, what you think are biological traits, that's not objectively true. We are radically skeptical about biology, science, and any category. So they would reject it, that these things actually formulate your gender and sexual identity. Then the second postmodern principle is socialization. They believe societies are made out of hierarchies, and those hierarchies are inherently oppressive, and they are unjust, if you like. And they say these hierarchies that have power dictate what can be known and what can't be known, and how it should be known, if you like. And they say these so-called truths are perpetuated with the use of language. And they say that since these hierarchies dictate what can be known or not known, then it's dictated by these power structures. So we reject these power structures, or we give ourselves the own power, our own agency, or we agitate these power structures to give us a new sense of freedom. And they also adopt this Derridian understanding of language, which is total bakwas. Yes. Derrida, French philosopher, most of the people who are crazy are French philosophers, yeah? Like Foucault, who talked about power and socialization. Yes. Foucault was khabith. Mm-hmm. He used to rape Tunisian boys in graveyards, yeah? Anyway.
This is necrophilia.
Yeah, so the Derridian understanding of language is that language doesn't represent reality, which is kufr, because Allah says Allah taught Adam the names of things. These include names, features, properties, and as we know from the tafsir, the exegesis. So we believe language does represent things, but he says language is just relational and binary. Mm-hmm. And therefore, inherently it's oppressive, but it doesn't represent reality. And that's why the queer theorists say categories or terms like heterosexual, homosexual, this, that, and the other. They're all made up. They don't represent reality. We can make up a new language to give you a new identity. And this is the problem. And Derrida makes his argument that, if you think of the term male and female, and you say, what is the opposite of a male? You say a man, you say a woman. So I say, look, it's relational and it's hierarchical. And that's oppressive.
Philologists actually basically
and he came up with the term phallogocentrism, which basically is that a Western language in general is inherently male dominant, or it's got a male hierarchy. Now, so queer theorists would reject language, reject these power structures, and say we could agitate them, create new power, new language to create new identity. Now, how does this fit in? Well, let me just explain it with another thinker, Judith Butler, who's a lesbian philosopher. She publicly says this, and because she's a queer theorist, and based on these type of principles, she's developed something called gender performativity, that you perform your gender, not like an actor or an actress, but just like when someone in a Western culture says, a priest might say, I hereby announce you as man and wife. So he's within a certain power structure. He has power, because they say the power invested in me. I hereby announce you as man and wife. He has power, and he uses that power with language. He perpetuates that kind of power through language. I hereby announce you man and wife. And all of a sudden they're man and wife. But 2 seconds ago, they weren't man and wife. But because of his power and the language that he used, they're man and wife. So that's a quite smart move what she's done, to be honest. And she says gender is the same.
Yes.
It's just you could have your own agency, your own language, and you could be whatever you want, because we reject biology. We're very radically skeptic. We reject linguistic categories. We reject social hierarchy. So it's all about your own internal shahawat. And that's why today you could be a man, tomorrow you could be a woman, and on Friday you could be non-binary. Now the way to agitate that is to basically say, okay, if these principles are true, if what you're saying is correct, then I could be a black lesbian. No problem. I could be a black lesbian, because no biological marker dictates who I am.
Yes.
There's nothing that you can see, or even in my behavior, that would dictate my identity. So I could make the claim I'm a black lesbian, and you would have to believe me. We could go even further. I can say I'm a cat.
Yes.
Meow.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with that according to their theory. So that's another religion which we summarize in a nutshell. So we talked about secular liberalism.
Okay.
We talked about
secularism, liberalism, and the
LGBT plus, and the other one is now atheism.
Yes. Which do you think it's a byproduct, or basically atheism started all these things?
That's a very good question. I don't think atheism started all of these things.
Yes.
What started all of these things is most likely secularism or liberalism, because they had enough of God.
Yes.
They just said, God's not working for us. Religion is not working for us. Because when you see the thinkers in Europe, you saw from like the 14th, 15th century and onwards, there was a conflict between the Catholic Church. It would use the coercive arm of the state to prevent any thinking that was incongruous with its doctrine.
Because of the church attitude also.
Yeah, the church attitude. But he was using the coercive arm of the state. And then you had the Reformation, and then you had the religious wars, you had the 80-year wars, the 30-year wars, the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day. And Professor John Charving...
And again, rise of Puritanism and...
Yes, I mean, there was also trade rights going on, or other complicated issues. But what's interesting, Professor John Charving makes a very good point. He says this facilitated thinkers to create an individualist doctrine, to move away from God's perceived will for society. And they said, look, we just have to focus on the individual now. And since God wasn't working for them from a political, social perspective, we don't need any God anymore. Which is really, in a way, the Nietzschean prophecy, right? Nietzsche prophesized in a way that, Europe doesn't believe in God anymore. God is dead, not ontologically, but God is dead in people's hearts. And he realized that, well, what's going to be the basis for your values now? And that's why he had the Übermensch, the Superman. That you're going to be a Superman. You're going to be the basis for your values. But then he also realized the problem here. He realized that if we all become the basis for our own moral values, then if there's any conflict between them, then what do you do?
Yes, sir.
And that's why maybe you have the notion of might is right. If you have power, then you're right. Yes. But anyway, so atheism, maybe it's a longer history, because atheism can be traced before. It could be traced back to the ancient times. Even in Islamic history.
Even the communists, the Marx, he said that religion is an opium, and they actually negated God and all these things. So it's basically always a tool for every theorist or every movement which was against Islam or religion.
Yeah. So maybe. I mean, but the history of atheism is complicated because you have it in antiquity as well. You have it even in the Islamic period. You had Al-Ghazali write about the Dahriya in his book, The Alchemy of Happiness. He described them like ants walking on a book, and the black ink. They can't understand what the blank ink is because they're reductionists. They don't see things holistically. You had Abu Hanifa debating one of them. So we had different manifestations of atheism throughout history, Islamic and otherwise. But putting that to the side, atheism is now a kind of a religion because there are different forms of atheism. It's not merely the absence of belief, because many atheists are philosophical naturalists.
Agnostic.
Yeah, and they believe that there is no divine, there is no non-physical, and everything can be explained by physical processes in a reductive or non-reductive sense. So atheism for many people, not all atheists, it's a metaphysic, it's a lens, it's actually a religion. It's the religion, the naturalistic religion.
Yes.
And that's why even when scientists who are atheists or thinkers who are atheists, they would never accept God because it's their religion. It's their aqidah. Because remember, it's metaphysical naturalism. They already believe God doesn't exist.
Right.
They already believe that there is no supernatural, there's no non-physical, and everything can be explained in some way to physical processes. That's why you'll have Richard Dawkins saying that to explain the first living cell, he refers to panspermia. Panspermia is like a religious doctrine. It's like they believe an alien put the first living cell on a meteorite and it came on Earth. Would you believe it? So that's why many naturalists, many philosophical naturalists would have God replacements. Like in the philosophy of the mind, they have something called panpsychism. Like a form of panpsychism, one of the forms is that electrons have primary consciousness. Yes. Yeah, and it pervades the universe. Like this is like a God replacement, man. So that's why a form of atheism can be religion, because they are philosophical naturalists. As Dawkins says in his fiction book, The God Delusion, he says on, I think, page 14, essentially that atheists believe that the world can be explained only by physical processes, which is a philosophical, naturalistic outlook. And so from that perspective, atheism is a religion. Now, this is happening in Pakistan. And my view of Pakistani atheists, for example, they're extremely shallow. They're probably
illiterate. Completely.
Well, they're the most probably stupidest people I've met. Now, not with all due respect. I don't mean that in a bad.
I agree with you.
I mean, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, then it's a Pakistani atheist. And then it's a duck. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because many times when I engage with these Pakistani atheists, I have to correct them on their atheism. Yes. I have to become a better atheist than they are. They misquote the book, they misunderstand it. So I have to correct the view, and then I attack the view and break it down. And atheism, generally speaking, in Pakistan is based on a few things in my view. And we have to empathize because it's not all about attack.
True.
One of them is trauma. They have religiously inspired trauma. Let's be honest, some of our religious authorities are illiterate.
Completely ignorant.
Yeah, not all of them, but there's a lot.
Mostly.
I wouldn't say that, because from my experience, a lot of them that I've met, even from different backgrounds now in the modern age, they're studying, they're learning about the new world. So there is an improvement, yeah? And so what I would say is that a lot of them have religiously inspired trauma, either from their parents or the culture or the community or from religious authorities. And we have to have empathy and rahmah for them. It's not an excuse, but we have to get them to stand in the possibility that the meaning you've given this trauma is not the only meaning. Allah wants good for you. Allah, give the meaning Allah wants you to have so you can transcend that trauma.
But the basic questions you always face by the Pakistani atheist. One is the international atheist. They enter into a dialogue. They're philosophical, more philosophical. As you said, it's shallow. So what type of arguments normally you have? Must have been a very heated argument with Pakistanis.
Yeah,
so always a shallow person have a heated argument.
Not really, because over time you learn how to deal with these people. Because you have to develop emotional intelligence over time. Even if you didn't have it, it's going to be forced on you. Yeah. But the point about the trauma stuff, what I wanted to say was that that's not the only reason for Pakistani atheism. Another reason is an inferiority complex. They have a Gora complex, for example. Another reason is that they have a need to belong and a need to feel certain. So when you study social psychology, you know that the social influence is developed because we have a need to belong and we have a need to feel certain. If we can't find that belonging or certainty from our religious group, on campus, we're going to go to the dominant group to get that sense of belonging and certainty. And that's why we have a responsibility within our community to answer questions and to make sure that they belong within the practicing Muslim community. Because sometimes we could be a bit harsh which is not the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. But in terms of the questions, I think the major questions in Pakistan from an atheistic perspective is, why is there evil and suffering in the world?
Yes.
That's the main one. And which is quite funny because it's the most emotional argument.
Yes.
Because we know that's a false argument because it assumes that God is only good, powerful, or merciful. But we know that Allah is, you can't abstract His names and attributes away from the rest of His attributes. Allah is also Al-Hakim. He's the knowing, He's the wise, He's Al-Alim, the knowing. Allah has the picture, we got the pixel, and there's wisdom behind things. And Allah has given us reasons why there's evil and suffering in the first place. One such reason includes that life is a test. But we don't have to deal with that argument in depth right now. But that's one argument they usually use. The other things I've heard was trying to challenge existing arguments. And they do it in a very kind of, in a cliche way. They use outdated cliches. The other one is that they misquote or they misunderstand their own atheist preachers, if you like, or atheist priests or atheist thinkers. And you have to correct them and respond to that. That's the main crux of it, really. And look, even in the West, atheism is not that smart. Especially the new atheists.
Yes,
they're dead. Now it's more an agnostic
With the
atheism.
advancement of science, do you think they were talking about electrons, the quantum theory?
Well, it's good you mentioned this. Sorry. Another reason that they're atheists because of science. They believe science leads to atheism, which is totally a flawed idea.
The people in the world who practice LGBT, perhaps a little minority, but 1%, 2%, 3%. But how they have made hostage the entire international community, that even you cannot speak against them. I can give you the example that one of our friends who have been practicing in England for the last 35 years as a doctor, he wrote a scientific article, and it was published in scientific journal, in which he said the people who practice LGBT, they develop certain complications, health complications, and then they have to use permanent drugs, and it is a burden on the exchequer of Great Britain. He was called, and his license was cancelled.
Oh dear.
So how they made hostage?
It's an ideology. So I think, look, from a psychological point of view, because the philosophy is incoherent, totally.
Yes. I know if you have been living in the West, the problem is that you cannot talk against LGBT. They thought that it's one of the fundamental human rights.
Yeah, so we have no choice but to challenge this now. But there's no choice.
There's no choice.
We have to, whether we like it or not, because it's against humanity. Most non-Muslims disagree with this. They've had enough. And especially the trans movement and the queer movement, it's just absolutely, it's just going insane. But I think what we have to realize is look at the psychological motivations. Think about what Allah tells us about people like this, that they are basically taking the blameworthy desires, the desires as their Lord. And I believe this whole project is that some human beings are just chasing absolute freedom. And the irony is, absolute freedom is only an aspect of divinity. Allah is Al-Ghani. He is absolutely free. He's As-Samad, the absolutely independent. Everything depends on Him. So they have a skewed fitrah, or a covered or veiled fitrah that is making them chase this false notion of absolute freedom, which we could never become absolutely free. And a lot of it is basically the deification of the nafs, the deification of the hawa, the desire, the blameworthy desires. That's the best explanation I can think of from a psychological point of view, unless you could just believe that some of them are shayateen. They're just literally devils, yeah? Because think about what they're doing. They're stripping you away from your humanity. They have an incoherent philosophy. They are mutilating people. Because when you look at the transgender movement and the queer movement, based on this crazy false postmodern applied principles, they now have this thing called gender affirming care.
Yes.
Look at the word here, gender affirming care, as if it's lovely. And they would remove muscles from your forearm that can't grow back, and they'll create a phallus that doesn't work. If that doesn't work, they use a rectum. They use the rectum to create a phallus, which ends up smelling all the time and it grows hairs. I know this is crude, but this is mutilation. They remove breast tissue of minors.
Yes.
And they were complaining about circumcision. It's night and day difference, man. And so they mutilate people, and people are going to be taking these people to court in the next 5 years. There are going to be an increase in court cases. Watch this space. And, you know, unfortunately, these people with gender dysphoria, transgender people, they're not treated with care. Real care is what Muslims do. Like we would consider it as a gender dysphoria and take you on a psychological journey so you realign yourself with your innate nature. We're not going to mutilate you and celebrate what is frankly a psychological disorder. And that's why they really hate these people, these ideologues. You know when they say love is love as a trap? This is a rhetorical trap. If love is love, then the logic is, you could basically say water is water, drink from the toilet. You could say food is food, eat a dead person. You could say intercourse is intercourse, make love to a corpse.
Yes.
You're not going to accept that. It's a rhetorical trap. And we have to make them realize, what is love? Love really entails that you're committed to the goodness and guidance of people. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ said. In Tariq al-Kabir, narrated by Bukhari, some scholars said it's authentic. Love for linnas, love for humanity, what you love for yourself. Even the famous hadith in An-Nawawi, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه. You won't truly believe unless you love for your brother, what you love for yourself. And Nawawi said this includes insaniya, humanity. From what point of view? We don't love of kufr, so we don't have a love of kufr because that's disbelief, but we love for people. And there's an interesting distinction that Islam makes, that you don't love disbelief, but you love for people. You want goodness for them and guidance for them. You're committed to their well-being. And now he mentions this, goodness and guidance. And you have other scholars like Ibn Taqiq al-Eid that mention this, Al-Ghazali that mentions this, something similar. So Muslims have real love. We are dedicated, whoever you are, Muslim, non-Muslim, we're dedicated to your goodness and guidance. That is love. They don't love because they're not dedicated to the goodness and guidance. They want you to reduce yourself to an animal. They want you to identify with just with your blame, with your desires. They want to mutilate you. How is that love? So don't fall for this rhetorical trap. And we have to push back because we have a duty to mankind. Islam is the last force, I think, in dealing with these evil ideologies that is trying to destroy humanity. And non-Muslims will support us.
The body of knowledge which has been created in the last 200-300 years, they created a fallacy, for example, which actually promote atheism, I think so. I don't know what is your response. That the 2-3 words, for example, one is scientific truth, and this is ultimate. Second, the theory of cause and effect. So nothing is, which in Islam also, illatu malul, which you can say this. And people actually believe in science and they think, whatever we have actually seen, we have to believe in that. Do you think that this body of knowledge, which provides the philosophy of science, has helped a lot in creating atheism?
I think atheists misuse science, for sure. But if you go into the academic works of the philosophy of science and even science in general, you wouldn't really find good academics that are worth their salt, if you like, would even make the claim that science directly denies God. They wouldn't really say that. Like
but they can use it.
They can, yeah, so they misuse it. That's the problem.
They misuse it.
So the reason they misuse it is for various reasons. So they may argue that the scientific method leads to the denial of God. And they will say that is because they mix up two notions, or they conflate two ideas, methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. So methodological naturalism is not a worldview. It just says for a scientific theory to be considered as scientific, or a scientific conclusion to be considered as scientific, you cannot refer to the divine or the supernatural. But that doesn't mean God doesn't exist. You could still believe in God for other reasons, for example. Like Scott C. Todd, a famous evolution biologist, said that a scientist is not committed to naturalism. For science he is, for it to be scientific, you can't refer to God, but you could believe in God. It's not a worldview. The other type of naturalism, metaphysical or ontological naturalism or philosophical naturalism, is a worldview. They don't believe in God from the beginning. They don't believe in the supernatural, and they believe everything can be explained in some way, reductive or non-reductive, to physical processes. They make those two things the same. Just because science in general refers to methodological naturalism that says your conclusions, if they're scientific, you can't refer to God, it doesn't now mean God doesn't exist. That would be adopting a philosophical naturalistic point of view, and they're making them the same. It's a forced conflation. The other problem that they have is they misunderstand the method of science. Because if you look at the basic idea of science, going to Bertrand Russell, the grandfather of neo-atheism, he was a mathematician and philosopher. In his book, Religion and Science, he basically says that science is focusing on observations. And we use reasoning to understand those observations, to discover facts about the world and laws connecting facts with one another. Professor Elliot Sober, who's an atheist and a philosopher of science, he says the same thing in his essay Empiricism, that at any moment in time, scientists are restricted to the observations they have at hand. So it's observations. So when you think about Allah, Al-Khaliq, the creator, we also believe in that he is transcendent. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. He's not observable, he's not empirical, yani.
Yes.
So already you should know that science, the scientific method can never deny Allah. Why? Because it's a limited study, limited method of study. It focuses on what is observed. Allah cannot be observed. Simple. And they misuse the scientific method. It's equivalent of me going to a palace with 1,000 rooms, and I could see all the rooms are numbered, 1 to 1,000. And I go to the first room, I open the room and I see the studio.
Yes.
And then I close the room. Then I speak to my friends. I said, I went to the palace. There was 1,000 rooms. And they would say, what did you do? I said, I went to the first room and I saw this studio. And they said, what was in the other rooms? And then I say, nothing. And they say, how do you know? Because I went to the first room. If there is something in the first room, there is nothing in all the 999 rooms. It doesn't logically follow. That's what atheists do when they use the method of science to deny God. Now, what science can do is stay silent on the topic, or it can provide evidence, which is evidence includes scientific evidence or scientific theories that philosophers could reason over to prove God's existence or deny his existence. But these are not scientific arguments. They're called evidential arguments. They're philosophical arguments. But in general, the scientific method does not lead to atheism at all. To make such claim is ridiculous.
You talked about the misuse. Do you think that the book Origin of Species of the Darwin, actually it paved the way for misusing the science in favor of atheism?
Of course, because what's interesting, even Darwin said that his theory could be changed by new observation.
Because all archaeological investigations, all these things, Margaret Mead theory of these Amazon forests, they actually they gather it with, and then they relate it to the Darwin, and then they
look.
This is
Darwinism in terms of the empirical studies is not my specialty.
Yes.
But I would just quote you one thing which really solves the problem, I think, for the layman. Richard Dawkins is one of the most evangelical atheists and an evangelical Darwinist. In his book, A Devil's Chaplain said the following: Our successors in the 21st century may have observations that actually change Darwinism or reject it completely. Simple as that. What does that show you? That scientific method is the ilm of dhann, is dhanni, speculative. We love it because it gives us, medicine,
it's all speculation,
technology. But at the end of the day, it's speculative from point of view of belief, and it can change. You can always have another observation or new data or new background information that change your current explanations. Simple as that. This is well known in the philosophy of science. If you study the inductive inference, the inference of the best explanation, you can have a new observation that can contradict your current conclusions, that changes your data, that's based on limited data, and therefore you have to change your conclusion. Or you could have a new background information with new observations or new data that you change your explanation to another explanation that best explains the new data and the new background information. So that shows to you it's the shifting sands of science. It's progressing, it's changing. So that's one thing we need to understand. So, if we consider the Quran to be from Allah and we have reasons and arguments outside of science to show that, then this is from Allah. And if there's any friction between Quran and scientific theory, it's not an issue.
It's not.
Because you will be committing an epistemological disqualification.
Excellent.
One is from God who has the picture, one is for humans and we have the pixel. So it's not the same epistemic way, it's not the same truth value.
Excellent.
But that doesn't mean you reject the science.
Yes.
We could still accept it practically, but not in your aqidah.
Yes.
And we accept it practically because we know it might work. And if it works, it might give us good results. And if it works, it doesn't mean it's true.
Yes.
Although the scientific readers were originally motivated by the idea that just because science works, it must be true, but they knew there is no necessary link between something working and something being true. You should know this if you're a married man. just because the way you treat your wife works, it doesn't mean it's true. So you may say to your wife, yes, darling, you're right. Of course you're right. Yes, darling, you're right. Just because that attitude works, it doesn't mean she's always right. Likewise, when a wife says to her husband, gee, of course, the sky is red, it's not blue. Yes, the grass is not green, it's purple. You're right. You're my badshah. You're my king. You're this, of course. Now that woman's approach works, but it's not true, because it's not always true that the husband's right. Yeah, do you see the point? So, and we know this in the history of science. So, for example, Professor Elliot Sober, he makes a really good point. He says false theories can work better than true ones, and that's the philosophy of science. And interestingly, if you go to the theory of phlogiston in the 1700s, the theory of phlogiston was that if you burnt combustible objects that released phlogisticated air. The theory was that when you burn combustible objects, it would release phlogisticated air. Dan Rutherford in 1772 used that workable theory to discover nitrogen, but then we realized that phlogiston was false. Yeah. So we learned that a theory that works can produce a truth that later is found out to be false. And the history of science is literally...
Same as the ether. Before Einstein, they
said I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
And they actually calculated the light speed and heat intensity, everything. And Einstein said ether doesn't exist.
Yeah, for sure.
And they said for the last 200 years you were teaching something which is false. And in the name of science.
But it worked. So the thing is, it shows us that just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. So we could use these theories that may go against the Quran practically, don't put it into your Aqidah, practically to discover new stuff, but we accept the Quran always into our Aqidah. So we don't need to commit an epistemological disqualification.
So last question.
Yes.
And there's a war of lifestyles. And it was actually, Quran says, tariqatukum al-muslah. That the threat of Moses to the pharaohs was a threat to the lifestyle. Do you think that this entire Western world is a complete lifestyle based on secularism, liberalism, atheism, and all these things, and it's a threat, or a Muslim society which has not yet even adopted lifestyle, it could become a threat to the Western world?
Well, look, the nature of every worldview and ideology is that it wants to protect itself and it wants to propagate itself. So it would see anything against it as a threat in some form.
But I just mentioned the talk of George W. Bush and Tony Blair.
Yeah, so these are the ideologues, but it depends what you mean by West, because I don't like using East-West distinctions sometimes, because there's a lot of people in the West that like Islam. There's a lot of people in the West who don't believe in Islam, but they appreciate Muslims, they appreciate ideas that are not liberal. Like, not everyone is a extreme liberal or an ideologue, or many of them are not postmodernists, for example. They're just normal human beings that want to pay the bills, take care of their family, yeah? So sometimes we make these distinctions in a kind of too broad ideological sense, but on a practical
compartment.
Yeah, on a practical level, look, what does Allah tells us? He says in Surah Mumtahana, verse 8, Allah does not forbid you to be fair and kind with those who do not fight you for your religion and do not expel you from your homes. Allah using the form of the word bir, which means righteousness. Yes, we should be righteous to all people. As long as you're not fighting me for my religion, you're not expelling from my home, I'm taking care of you, I'm righteous towards you. But your point is about the challenge of worldviews. Yes, there are worldview clashes. Like, liberalism is incompatible with Islam. Orthodox Islam. Secularism is completely incompatible with Islam. So yeah, there is a clash of worldviews, but how do we deal with this clash of worldviews? I really believe that the way to deal with this clash of worldviews is, number one, that we have intellectuals and we have thinkers that produce intellectual content to challenge the foundations, the philosophical foundations and the ideas of these worldviews, to start to win the hearts and minds over people. And we'll do it with hikmah and hasana, as Allah says in chapter 16, verse 1 to 5, Udu'u ila sabili rabbik, call to the way of your Lord. How? With hikmah, with wisdom, and preach them with hasana, meaning with goodness, with rahmah, with ihsan, with excellence. And hikmah means having an Allah-centric goal. You apply your ilm in a particular context to achieve that goal. So we need to be people of wisdom and rahmah and hasana. So we need to challenge these ideas intellectually. At the same time, we need to live Islam as a community. from an individual, personal, and societal level. So we become a beacon of light for people. People see like, wow, this is what true values are. This is the values that are in line with my fitrah. These are the values in line with my innate nature. And humanity, even if they don't believe in Islam, they'll be attracted to it over time because they'll see how beautiful it is, right? A good word, as Allah says, is like a good tree with deep roots, right? And it has like, fruits and so on and so forth. So we need to be beacons of light, because sometimes we have this false notion that it's about just challenge of ideas. And that is a bit problematic, because we assume the human being is just an artificial intelligence robot that you type in an algorithm, you're going to expect certain results. But even in modern cognitive science, which aligns itself in some way with Islamic psychology, we have emotions, we have a nafs, we have a qalb, we have a ruh, we have a fitrah. So even when people believe to be rational, according to cognitive science, is driven by emotive and psychological forces. So we need to appreciate what the human being is. So therefore, we need to show them examples. We need to show them personal examples, familial, societal, political, if we can. So we become beacons of light for the world. Because essentially, we want good for people. Simple as that. We want good for all people, even the ideologues, even the LGBTQ people, even the nasty liberals, and the ones who are ideologues who don't like us, We want good for them. We want guidance for them, goodness for them, and we're committed to the well-being. And the way to frame that from a clash of ideas point of view is we have to be brave, intellectually brave, like Dr. Shabir Akhtar, who passed away around a month ago. May Allah grant him Jannatul Firdaus. When I spoke to him, I had dinner with him, and it was during dinner, he made a beautiful point. He said, what's the point of being an intellectual if you're going to be a coward? And it's so true. We need to have intellectuals and people who could speak and even on a basic level, societal level, on an individual level, to share these ideas and to show how profound they are. And that requires a sense of bravery. Don't be afraid. At the end of the day, what's the worst that can happen? You die. And where do you go as a Muslim when you die? If you have husn al-dhan billah, you have a good opinion of Allah. As Allah says in the Hadith Qudsi, I am as my servant expects that I am as my servant thinks that I am. You're going to find Allah in the best of your expectations. He is Al-Wadud, the most loving. He is Ar-Rahman. So the worst that can happen is you're with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Khalas. So, I'm trying to encourage you to think that, and in intellectual discourse, in the challenge of the battle of ideas, you're not going to die. You're not going to get killed. It's very rare. So I'm just saying that from a kind of hyperbolic point of view, a mubalagha, just to make you realize Allah has your back. Take the step forward. Engage with these ideas in Pakistan and around the world on a familial, social, personal, societal, political level. And things will change over time. We just have to arise and warn, just like the Prophet ﷺ did.
Jazakallah khair, Jazakallah khair. I'm really obliged. And it was a wonderful session. Thank you very much.
Allah bless you. Jazakallah khair.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have no more words to say. No more words to say. An extraordinary man, an extraordinary personality. Allah has given so much knowledge to him. He is a blessing for us. He is a blessing for us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair.